Good evening, everyone. We'd like to get started. Thank you all for being here with us tonight. I'm Tom Gates. I'm the Roanoke County Administrator. And tonight we'd like to talk a little bit about the Mountain Valley Pipeline and perhaps some of the things that we expect to see and to be a participant in the coming months for this project that increasingly looks like will be a reality. We'll talk a little bit about where we are in the regulatory process shortly, but mostly what we want you to be able to take away from this evening is that the county has been planning for the pipeline construction, and our objective here really is to make sure that through the course of whatever transpires, we can keep everyone safe and we can ensure that everyone's rights are protected. With me this evening on the stage is Fire Chief Steve Simon, Police Chief Howard Hall, and Richard K. Wood, the Assistant County Administrator, who has been our point person for the Mountain Valley Pipeline Project for a couple of years now. Also standing down on the floor here, Amy, raise your hand, is Amy Whitaker, our Public Information Officer. A little bit later, she'll talk about our communication tools and how we'll make sure that everyone is continually informed about the progress of the Mountain Valley Pipeline, should that come to pass. Also with me this evening is the Board of Supervisors Chair Martha Hooker and Board of Supervisor member Joe McNamara. And I'm going to turn the mic over to them for a minute and ask them to make any comments they'd like to make.
Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. I just wanted to greet you, tell you that we are glad that you're here, that we share many of the same concerns that you have, that we have very good staff who have been doing their due diligence and studying the issues and have been way ahead of the curve on many of these issues. They're going to be visiting with you tonight and sharing some of those things that they've studied. There may be some things that are still fluid, that they are still learning about as it happens, but we want you to know what we know and give you as much information as possible. Thank you again for being here, and I'll turn it over to Mr. McNamara.
Thanks. I'm sure many of you wish you weren't here, but you are, and some of you probably some of you are for a pipeline, and that's really not what this is about. What this is about is trying to share information. I mean, there's been a lot of research done. I think Mr. Kaywood, I'm not sure, post-pipeline, I'm not sure what he's going to do.
All those other things Tom wants me to do.
But, yeah, there's been an awful lot of work for some of these guys. I know it's, you know, it pulls on a lot of your heart, your strings, and it gets you, and I understand that, and we understand that. As many of you know, it's a pipeline, whether it's good, bad, right, wrong, those decisions aren't being made in Roanoke County. But Roanoke County's role is to understand, facilitate, coordinate, and as was mentioned before, keep everybody safe. So thank you very much for coming tonight. Let's hear, we've actually heard some of the presentations already, but they're good presentations. I think it'll help us all as we continue down this path. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNamara. And I'm going to turn this over to Richard K. Wood.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I share all the same sentiments that you just heard. Just kind of basically the agenda for this evening. We've done the introductions. We are going to do a formal presentation. And what we would like folks to do is, if you do have a question, you should have gotten some cards when you came in. There's not a huge number of people here tonight, so I don't think that part is going to take all that long. We do have more staff than you see here off to the side, and as soon as the formal part's over, we will stay around for a while and answer any individual questions that you may have. But again, our goal really is to let you know what we know up until this evening. So literally there's some things that happened today on the project, so every day there's a new event. I know most everyone is familiar with this, but I just wanted to set the stage for someone who may sort of just be getting familiar with the project. It's a 303-mile project. It's 42-inch high-pressure natural gas pipeline. being a 42-inch pipeline makes it one of the largest pipeline projects in the country to be built to date. There's been a few others in the country, but a lot of the other pipeline projects that you may have heard about are actually significantly smaller pipe, and we'll tell you more about that in a little bit. It goes from sort of south central West Virginia to Pennsylvania County, and it was originally announced way back in 2014, which seems like a really long time ago now. The project was approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in October. The State Water Control Board approved the project in December. Shortly after that, there was a series of very rapid approvals from other federal and state agencies. FERC, who was kind of the mothership for all of this, issued the initial notice to proceed just earlier this week for initial work to start in West Virginia. There's also a sister project to this, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, that has a very similar origin. It actually goes more through eastern Virginia. Work is already underway in Virginia on that project as we speak, again, mainly with tree clearing. Within Roanoke County, the project is around 8 miles long, just a little bit more than that. It affects directly, roughly 55 parcels. However, there's many more parcels that are very close to it that it doesn't actually touch. So I don't want to paint the picture that it only affects this many people. It affects a whole lot more people than that, but it actually touches 53 parcels. Significantly, it crosses both Poor and Bent Mountain. The Poor Mountain crossing is the highest point on the entire 303 miles in what is probably the most challenging terrain from a construction perspective. So even if the project were something that everybody wanted, it's going to be very challenging to build in Roanoke County because of the terrain. And a lot of our concerns that we've expressed to date spring from that. It also crosses the Blue Ridge Parkway in Roanoke County, and that's the part of the county where you're just barely over the line from Franklin. So Franklin's literally in sight, but that parkway crossing is in Roanoke. As far as sort of who's in charge of what with the project, FERC, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has by far and away the lion's share of the authority on the project. They're what's called a lead agency, and they basically run the show. And over the years, Congress has invested a huge amount of the authority for projects of this type in FERC, and in some ways they're managed differently than many other projects that you may see in a community, like a highway project or, for example, a local developer project. And what that really does is it diminishes the state role and essentially eliminates the local role in the regulatory process. So our participation has geared around making comments to other people who have actual regulatory authority, because we have very little on the project. We are a small part of a big project, and then another important thing to keep in mind when you think about this in its totality, we are also a small part of 2 of these projects that are going on at once. So there's going to be a lot of activity along the state. Obviously, what's going on in Roanoke County is of most importance to us, but it's kind of important to understand it in its context of a lot of work going on around the state. And our efforts to date have really kind of been threefold. First and foremost, we've tried to keep folks engaged and informed. We've done that through what we think is a pretty good map that we've developed and website. Our Board of Supervisors formed the Pipeline Advisory Committee that met very regularly while the project was really in that regulatory process, really up until late last year. And our sort of the third leg of that stool has been what I would call a robust participation in the regulatory process, some of which we think has made some changes to the project that have been positive for the county. In particular, the route has moved away from the reservoir that was an important concern of ours. And within that process, it's so big you can't focus on everything. So there's really been 2 things that Roanoke County has focused on most specifically. The first would be protection of water. And that's really 3 different kinds of water. So it's really wells and springs for folks' personal use, because everybody in the county, to our knowledge, that's directly affected by the project or directly touched by the right-of-way is on a well or a spring. The reservoir specifically, because it's very close to where the pipeline crosses the Roanoke River. And then I'd say third, just from a more general or global water quality perspective for the environment. And then the other main area that we have focused on, because we are somewhat uniquely positioned as a county, are archaeological and historical resources. We're what's called a consulting party in the Section 106 process, which is the federal process that tries to regulate those resources. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Chief Simon, our fire chief.
Good evening. Fire Rescue started to get involved in this project a number of months ago. Fire Rescue is tasked with emergency management of the county, and what that means is whenever there's a large-scale event that could impact the public safety of the county, Fire Rescue takes the coordinating lead. That doesn't mean we're going to do everything. That just means we organize the county resources to go ahead and mitigate the situation. Obviously, this summer, it looked like the Mountain Valley Pipeline was going to become a reality. So we went ahead and sort of ramped up our resources along with the police department resources, along with some of the other departments, our public information, which Amy will talk to briefly here in a moment, our community development, which we have staff here also, our communications and 911 center, county attorney's office, county administration, and then our sheriff's office. And this is what we would do in a large-scale event. This project is going to be a very large construction endeavor. It's going to go through large parts of the county. The likelihood of some type of injury for a construction worker is probably going to happen. That's just based on the largeness of this project. Challenges that we have is the remoteness of the property and the area that we're going to go ahead and have to go in and do any type of rescues, and that would imply any type of rescue that we would go ahead and do. So fire rescue's involved in that aspect. But we also go ahead and from a coordinating body gets other organizations in. So looking over some of the agencies throughout the state that would help us in a large-scale emergency would be the Virginia State Police, the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, VDOT obviously, State Health Department, the Commonwealth's Attorney, and regional law enforcement. All of those entities are working together to make sure we keep the public safe in all matters of this construction and into the future once the construction's done. Fire rescue specifically, obviously we're going to go if someone calls 911, citizens or anyone, visitors, we're going to go in and respond to that incident appropriately and mitigate the event. Some of the things that fire rescue has been doing is that we have looked at where the route is and where would we go ahead and gain access. A lot of that information we don't know yet because MVP hasn't supplied us everything. Hopefully we'll get that information in time, and once we get that, we'll be able to go ahead and respond appropriately. Fire suppression, if there's obviously a brush fire, if there's a forest fire, if there's any type of fires related to this incident, fire rescue takes the prime lead on that. The fire marshal actually will go ahead and issue permits, a burn permit or a blasting permit, and the fire marshal's office works out of my office, and they will go and issue those permits. However, MVP has not told us what type of clearing they're going to do. We know they're going to take down the trees, but we don't know how they're going to remove those trees. Any type of burning, any type of blasting does have to go through our permitting process. We would go ahead and have fire marshals on the scene to make sure that is done appropriately. So we will follow that procedure like we would do with any other landowner in the county or any other business that would want to go through that process. After this pipeline is done, this is a new pipeline for Roanoke County, and it is a large pipeline, but we do have other pipelines in Roanoke County. The Fire Rescue Department has contingency plans for those other pipelines. So this is something that we're not necessarily new to us. Yes, this is a different style of pipeline, but we do have contingency plans. We do training in worst-case scenarios, and part of what we're doing from a public safety standpoint is trying to figure out every type of scenario that could happen and then sort of go ahead and worst-case scenario, and then we go ahead and try to develop a contingency plan to mitigate that response. And that's what fire rescue, that's what the police department, and that's what all those other agencies are here to do, to go ahead and make sure the public stays safe during this process. Turn it over.
All right, thank you. Probably the most important thing that I'll say tonight, and that I hope you remember, is that the police department and our officers are neither supporting or opposing this particular project. Our job is to police and conduct our business regardless of anybody's particular viewpoint for or against. In terms of the project, you've heard that the scope is rather large. We have made clear to EQT that the security of their project, their construction sites, their storage areas, whatever they establish, is their responsibility. Our officers will not be providing that service to them. My understanding is that EQT is planning to hire private security for that purpose. Therefore, we have made sure they understand that there are certain rules in Virginia about private security. Essentially, they have to be registered with the Department of Criminal Justice Services and have some training requirements that whoever gets contracted will have to meet. So our key objectives are not that much different than our objectives on a daily basis, which would be protection of life and public safety, protection of property. In this particular case, certainly protecting and facilitating people's First Amendment rights, again, regardless of what position or expression they may want to make, as well as enforcement of any court orders, and as Chief Simon's already indicated, cooperation and working with our regional partners. You see a couple of members of state police are here tonight. We're coordinating closely with them, as well as other public safety agencies in the region to try to ensure that this project, if it happens, goes as safely as possible. Now, in terms of First Amendment rights, we are happy to coordinate and even facilitate people or groups that want to express their opinions, again, regardless of what they are, and are happy to help you do that. Citizens or groups that would want to do that can contact us. In a minute, Ms. Whitaker is going to provide a single point of contact number as well as an email that we're going to encourage you to use for this purpose so that we can track information and questions incoming. People that use that will be contacted by appropriate members of staff if they want assistance. Now, in most of the areas that are affected in Roanoke County, there are limited public venues for groups to gather. However, again, if there's some interest or somebody who wants to, we will try to help to the degree that we can identify where an appropriate place would be. Certainly, people are free to use private property so long as they have the permission of the property owner to do that, and so long as the use of that property falls within the appropriate county code and any relevant zoning. So again, we will try to provide assistance and we'll provide ample opportunity for people or groups to comply with the law as this project potentially proceeds. That being said, some of the things that we will be advising those who may want to gather and demonstrate or express their opinions is certainly people or groups cannot commit criminal acts in the course of doing that. They can't block or interfere with traffic or public movement. Can't interfere with any authority granted by a court for anyone to do anything, and that would certainly include the companies that might be constructing the pipeline. Obviously, violent acts aren't appropriate or allowed. Any type of trespassing. And it's important to note in Virginia, the state code prevents people from wearing masks or face coverings to prevent identification or to conceal their identities. So outside of that, our call response will not be that much different than it is every other day. We certainly will respond to emergencies, to disturbances, to people that are in need of help. That includes criminal activity, disorders, things of that nature. We do that every day. We will do our best to work on any issues around traffic or movement of traffic. There'll certainly be probably large vehicles involved in this project that may be on roads that are smaller than we would like. The county police department doesn't have jurisdiction over oversized loads or overweight loads. VDOT is responsible for all of our roadways in Roanoke County. The permitting for that goes through DMV and the state police for that type of thing. And of course, any assistance that they might need from us, we'll be attempting to provide. Our officers will probably not be able to help very much with issues between individual citizens and the construction company. And that could be things like disputes over where an easement is or some sort of property damage around the construction itself. That would be a civil matter. Again, back to that single point of contact, one of the reasons that's being set up is so that people can make contact with the county, and we would likely have a non-public safety person trying to facilitate anything we can in those areas. So the bottom line is, we're continually, as everyone else is, evaluating and monitoring what's going on so that we can develop appropriate responses and use the resources that we have as efficiently as we can to ensure that everybody is safe during this project. Mr. Kaywood.
Okay, just have one slide here for me. As I mentioned earlier, one of our goals that we've had throughout the project from a county perspective is really focusing on the environment, and in this context, that primarily means water quality. And that is one of the issues that we certainly think could happen during construction. So, for example, there's a slope slide or there's release of sediment from the project, and we expect that we as a county would receive calls about that. And DEQ really has the primary oversight role of E&S on the project, and it's our understanding they'll have 2 people in the field in our region trying to oversee that, but we think an important role that we would have would be to help coordinate and make sure those issues get resolved, because in addition to not wanting to see the impact on the water or on the neighbors, Roanoke County also has water quality permits that it's responsible for in the Roanoke River that we spend quite a deal of money trying to keep clean and even improve its water quality. So we have a very vested interest in ensuring that there's not erosion and sediment from the project. And I would see our role in that as a lot of troubleshooting. Even though we're not the regulator or the responsible party, I think we're going to be putting a fair amount of effort into making sure that that's done properly. And then I think on a project of this nature, particularly with the topography, it's going to be stabilization after the work is complete. I think is going to be very challenging and time-consuming, and I think that our staff will have a great deal of involvement in trying to ensure that that is completed properly, because that's just as important in some ways as how the work is done initially. Another couple of areas that you wouldn't necessarily immediately think about with the environment but are important to us, it's our understanding that the company could have up to 800 people in the area at one time working on the project. So that immediately brings to mind all kinds of zoning and sanitation issues that we want to ensure are done correctly. So, for example, in Roanoke County, you can't just go establish a campground or park your RV with somebody living in it just anywhere. That has to be done in a proper fashion, and there's both zoning permits and health department permits that are associated with either tent camping or RVs and things of that nature, and we want to ensure that everybody is living in a safe and sanitary way, and that's both a human safety issue and also a sanitation issue for the county. So that's something else that we regulate that you wouldn't naturally think of us as doing, but when you have that many people coming to town working on a project like this, that's something we want to make sure is done correctly. And I believe the next slide is Amy's, and then we're going to do a project walkthrough.
When you came in, you should have received a little card like this at the front table. If you did not, please take one or take several on the way out. I'm sure there are some people who were not able to come tonight, so you're welcome to take quite a few back with you and distribute it to others. So from the beginning, the communication's been very important to us. That's been one of our main objectives, is to keep you all as informed as we possibly can from what we understand about the project. So on our website, RoanokeCountyVA.gov, we have had a Mountain Valley Pipeline page, and it's on the buttons on the front page of the website. We just recently updated that. It is live today. We changed it so that there is contact information on there. We also have a section that has frequently asked questions. Some of the things that these 3 gentlemen have mentioned tonight are already on there. We will continually add to it if we hear citizens asking us other questions, just so that we can break down what some of those answers are and help you to understand better. Also on there is the ways that you're able to contact us. We want to make sure you know that you can contact us if it's not an emergency. So you would use the information that's on this card. We have a phone number that's designated, as well as an email address, and they will be checked Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. We will review those. We do have a couple of staff members who are backups for that, so it's always continually looked at. You will get a live person who will give you an answer or field it out to an appropriate staff member. But the point is, we want to make sure that if you feel like you have a question you need to ask, we are available for you to call us and ask. I believe that's all. We do have citizen alerts too. Also on this card, it says sign up for ROCO alerts. That is really emergency information that comes out from the county, and it can be for, many different things that we use. So this is something we already have established, but you do need to go online and you need to set that up yourself and enter your email address in, and then you can decide what alerts you want to receive, whether it's about trash schedules or anything related to the pipeline. So be sure and do that. And if you have any problems getting signed up, again, any questions, please let this phone number, this email address be your point of contact. Thank you.
And I'd like to really emphasize that last point. I know many of you in the room, when I look out and see, and I've probably talked to hundreds of different individual folks since the beginning of this project, and I know a lot of people have my email and my phone number. But I would really encourage you to make this email and phone number that you see on the screen your first stop, because if the project enters construction as we expect, I'm only one person. If you call this, you can access a much larger team a lot more quickly, and you're not just relying on me personally to call you back. There may be many things we receive through this number where I am the one that's going to call you back because of the nature of what your inquiry is, but you're going to get a better, faster response if you use this method. And again, we'd encourage you to share that with all your friends and neighbors. Anybody who has any interest in the project or any issue. And the personal commitment I'll make is there's a lot of issues that are outside of our direct control, but I'm going to try my hardest to help any citizen of the county resolve any problem they have with the project. If I'm unsuccessful, I'm unsuccessful, but that's what I've tried to do from the beginning is, we really want to help people. And sometimes that's just getting on the phone and maybe calling FERC or calling DEQ and saying, here's the issue. Is there any way we can get this person some help? They're having a hard time with this or that issue. And I think we're going to be doing a lot of that. With that, I want to walk through, and this will be the end of the formal presentation of us just standing here talking, walk through what we think the project is going to look like. And the first bullet I have up there is schedule. And this is something I wish I knew a lot more about. In a perfect world, we would actually wish that the company were up here giving this presentation, that they had published their schedule, what their project was going to look like, where they were going to start, how it was all going to unfold. They haven't done that, and they haven't told us any of that. All we know at this point is what they put in their legal filings, which is that they want to start work in Virginia by February 1st. And that's why we're here tonight, because February 1st is a week from today. And we wanted to talk to you all before work started in Virginia or in the county. But quite frankly, we don't really know, are they going to start work on February 1st or March 1st or a year from March 1st? And we don't know that because they haven't told us yet. So we are trying to encourage the company to give us detailed information about the schedule. We'd like to share that with the public. We hope they would do that directly. Right now, we just don't have that to share with you. We wish we did. These other titles I can go through pictorially, and I want to give the disclaimer that I am not a pipeline expert, and the pictures you're getting ready to see are taken from a bunch of different projects all around the country. A lot of them are from the Dakota Access Project because that had a lot of pictures online. I will tell you that pipe is about half of the size of this one, so it's going to look a little smaller in some of the pictures than what we expect to see here, and I'll try to point that out. So you're going to see a lot of different projects and not just one, but I tried to take what, based on all the research I've done, what I think this will look like from start to finish and what you as a resident or someone near the project or interested is likely to see as work starts. The first thing we expect to see is the creation of a very large staging, or what I would call a laydown area, somewhere in the area. Again, we don't know how many or where these will be in our area. These would be things that are outside of the FERC process, so this is not something where there's a picture or a square on a map. But typically, the larger staging areas, the project overall is broken down into 11 spreads or segments, the way they've divvied it up. Each one typically has one or two of these sites. They're somewhere in the 75 to 100 acre range. And this is where the contractor is probably going to be bringing a lot of pipe, a lot of equipment. It's probably going to be a very big, very visible site. And that really has to kind of start to come together in the early days of the project, because that's where all the other activity is going to spring from. Tree clearing. And really in the short run, this is tree cutting. There are some threatened and endangered species requirements that affect the project that prevent tree clearing in a lot of areas between the end of March and mid-November. So starting April 1st through, I believe it's November 16th, due to endangered and threatened bats and birds, you can't cut certain trees down. Well, on this project, they can't do any work until they cut trees down. So they have, thinking about it almost being February now, there's really a 2-month window in which they would have to get trees on the ground before they have to wait 6 months. And that's what they've been saying in their court filings, that they're very anxious to start this. But in the short run, all they have to do is cut the tree down. It doesn't have to go anywhere to meet this federal requirement. So we expect for a while it may look just like this, with trees that are just cut, but nothing else has happened yet. It may also look like this. This is a tree harvester. We don't know exactly how they're going to go about the tree cutting or clearing, but it could be a mechanized piece of equipment like this. The next significant stage of the project is everything that's left after the tree is removed. All the roots and topsoil and everything has to be cleared away. And when Chief Simon was talking earlier about on other types of construction projects, oftentimes people will want to burn that material, and that's where they would have to get a permit from the county, and that's a fairly tightly regulated process. But it would start to look like a clearing that you might see for a power line or some other utility at this stage. The next step, and this is where this is different than other types of construction, you basically have a road and a trench being kind of constructed in parallel, and you'll see the importance of those two pieces here in a second. And once the road is built and the trench is starting to be there, they have to bring the pipe out. I've actually seen some of this pipe from a train. I think it was probably going to the ACP, but it was the actual pipe being used in Virginia. It is very large. The sections are 40 feet long. They take up the entire length of a tractor trailer. This is not something that a couple of people could pick up and move. It's all going to be moved with equipment. So there's a very large operation just to move the pipe around and get it near where it's going to ultimately go. And I think that would be a very visible operation. This particular pipe may be a little bigger than ours. I'm not sure. This picture is actually taken in Canada, but it was the best picture I could find of somebody moving pipe to a pipeline project. The next stage, and this is Dakota Access, so this is a little smaller pipe, is the pipe has to be arranged in its near final position. So it has to be laid out on the ground. And you can see these very large pieces of equipment that are just there to handle the pipe and move it around. You can also see you have a fairly healthy road beside it. You all have seen pictures like this probably before with this kind of view of the project. The next step is the pipe has to be put together and bent to fit the contours of the land. And so there's what looks like this assembly line that goes up and down the road that I was describing earlier, with specialized pieces of equipment that bend the pipe. For any corner it has to turn, but in particular for up and down movement of the ground, it has to fit, because it's not flexible. And then there's a lot of work done to prepare the pipe to be welded together to make basically a single piece of pipe. Next step is to inspect and test and work on the welds, which I know very little about welding other than it's pretty important that they be done correctly and that there's a lot of inspection of these welds. So you probably see a lot of activity like that. Then the next big step, which I didn't really understand when I started learning about this project, is large, long lengths of this have to be picked up together and laid as a unit into the trench after all these other steps have finished, because it's so big it can't really be worked with once they get it sort of down into the trench to be ultimately backfilled. And again, this pipe in this picture is about half of the size of what we would see here, but as you can see, the terrain, even though there's no trees, looks a little bit familiar in that they're in the mountains with this picture. After that, pipe has to be backfilled. And then the process that I think Roanoke County and many citizens will be working with for a long time is the ground is supposed to be restored to its original contour and vegetation reestablished. And as we know from other projects in our area, that's often very challenging. We have highly erodible soils, we have steep slopes, we have a lot of things that work against this going well. And again, I think regardless of the nature of the project, this is going to be something that's going to take a lot of effort. And then you end up with a final product, and I chose this picture very intentionally. First, there's water in the bottom of the picture, which is something that's important to us, but you can see on this particular project that it doesn't look like everything kind of came into place just so at the top of the image. Looks like there's maybe some erosion there, even though it's turned green toward the bottom. These are things that would be of a big concern to Roanoke County if we saw something that looked like that in the county. So we're going to want to work with a company, with FERC, with DEQ, in this case, to make sure this area up here looks just as green as what you see below, because that's a direct threat to water quality if you have active erosion on any site in the county. So we would see ourselves spending a lot of time there. And then the final image, and this is, I believe, Campbell Hills subdivision in the county. This is not something the county made, but somebody else that was involved in the project did a rendering looking at it from the vantage point of a location in the county where, you know, the final product will look like probably a more curvy version of a fairly large electric utility corridor. So that is, from what we understand, the basic sequence of construction, sequence of operation. In addition to all this, I just didn't have pictures I could show you. Another significant thing that happens early on that's going to look very similar is there's quite a few access roads to get to where the project is going to be built that have to be constructed. The process will be very similar, except for they'll make a road after they clear the trees. But again, the roads themselves can have all the same issues that the main pipe corridor does, and we would be concerned about all of them. So at this point, we're going to go through whatever cards we have, and then when we run out, staff will just remain here to take questions. But again, I just want to, before we do the questions, just thank everybody for coming. I do encourage you to look at the new website that we put out there. We will use the alert feature that's on there to try to share information about the project, and we just want to make that useful to you. The last thing I want to share about the website is the frequently asked questions that we put there to start, obviously, were things we had to come up with ourselves, because that was before we had the benefit of hearing questions tonight and then questions that you may send to us. But we'll keep building that list through the life of the project, because we want to get as many useful questions and answers up on that site as we can. And with that, we will start working some of the questions here, and I like whoever typed all these, because this is easy for me to read. It's fairly long. This has 13 questions. The first question we have on here is, who will vet the security personnel of MVP, its agents or contractors, to ensure that they have the appropriate permits and or licenses to carry firearms? That sounds like a question for the police chief.
I can't tell you whether they're going to carry firearms or not. We don't have that information. As I said earlier, private security companies in Virginia the company itself and the employees of the company have to be registered with the Department of Criminal Justice Services. There are varying requirements depending on whether they are armed or unarmed security. Obviously, the requirements are a little more difficult if they decide to use armed security. The company is responsible for providing the required paperwork and certifications to DCGS before they certify them, and we have the capacity to check through DCGS when we know who the company is to ensure that they've done what they're supposed to do. The Department of Criminal Justice Services, I believe, is part of the Department of Public Safety. That is the agency that certifies police officers, deputy sheriffs, and they also have the responsibility for private security. If you go to their website, you can actually see what the specific requirements are.
Okay, the next question, Howard, is also going to be for you. Will the county prohibit any county employee from hiring themselves to MVP as agents or contractors for the purposes of security?
I can only speak for police department employees. But I have already informed EQT and their group that I am not going to allow off-duty police work on this particular project. As many of you know, we do provide off-duty services to like our schools for basketball games and sometimes churches for traffic control. I've already informed them we are not going to permit that. Internally, I've informed my staff that I'm not going to approve any secondary employment related to this project. Frankly, I don't know that I have any employees that want to. It is my understanding that the sheriff is going to do the same thing with his employees.
Okay, next question, and I'll field this one. Will MVP be allowed to work 24 hours a day? There's probably two aspects to this question from a county perspective. First, and this is where FERC is kind of in the overriding driver's seat, they have some language in the permit that says you should follow local ordinances unless basically they impede the construction of the project. It's kind of some vague language. I'm not quoting it exactly. It's our intent to ask the company and tell them what our noise ordinance is. We think they should follow it, which would restrict this. We don't know if FERC will cause that to happen or not, but our step one as a local government is to say we do have a local ordinance that appears to apply to your work, and that's how we start. Again, when you look around the country at these projects, FERC there's a mixed record of decisions with what local ordinances they will allow and which ones they won't, or which ones they will tell their contractors that they don't have to follow. But our first step is, again, trying to err on the side of we want to protect our citizens, and we would try to apply the same standard we would apply to any other similar work in the county and sort of take it from there to see how FERC reacts to that or what happens. But our first step is going to be to ask and to show them what our rules are. Next one I can also handle. How will MVP handle the crossing of public roads? Public roads are all under the purview of VDOT. I do know that MVP is in a permit process with VDOT for any impact to the secondary road system. We, as Howard mentioned earlier in his presentation, are very concerned about impacts to roads in general as far as blocking traffic or school bus impacts, trash collection impacts. We're sharing all that information with the company. I can tell you from having ridden many of them, there's some of the roads, if they were bringing in one of those truckloads of pipe, which is actually legal to do in Virginia unless a road is specifically restricted for trucks, if assuming it's a legal length and everything, it would be very difficult to get up these roads and still pass traffic going the other way. So there's going to have to be some, I'm sorry, I did not turn this off, some scheduling and coordination between the company and both the residents and school operations and trash operations. But again, VDOT's in the lead with that, but I think that we have a role as a county as well. Next one I think I can take as well. Are there plans by MVP to build camps for their personnel? The best answer I can give at this point is not that we are aware of. They have told us that they do not intend to have people live in the actual right-of-way of the project itself. As I mentioned earlier, and I think that this is a place that FERC doesn't govern, you can't just establish a work camp in the county without going through the zoning process, which in the area of the pipe, most places would require a special use permit or perhaps a rezoning. We have not been approached for that. So that's one place where Roanoke County's regulatory framework is perhaps a little different than some of the other jurisdictions along the route. So while we certainly expect there to be big crowds at all the places where you can legally and appropriately park an RV, I'd expect to see a lot of RVs there. I expect to see a lot of hotels and motels in the area full of folks. We don't expect there to be encampments of pipeline workers in the county. And again, that's something where I do believe we have regulatory authority. Question number 6, has MVP made monetary investments in the infrastructure of Roanoke County, or are they planning to invest in the repair when done? We are not aware today of any plans for MVP to make any kind of investment in the county. As part of the Section 106 process, we have asked for that because that's one of the mitigations that anybody affecting archaeological and historical resources, one of the things they can offer to do is to invest in a historic resource in the area. And for this project, we made a filing where we suggested that they may want to look at Bent Mountain Elementary School in the community center as a historic structure they might want to make an investment in as part of the Section 106 process because it is a historic structure. We happen to own it. We have no commitment that they're going to do that, but that was the one historic property we control that we thought they could if they wanted to do something to give back. Ultimately, if they're required to do that is up to FERC and some other agencies, not the county. I think some of the other counties along the route have done similar things with historic properties, but as far as any kind of funds or anything being done for the county or its residents as of today, we're not aware of any. Next one's going to be Howard's. Does law enforcement understand the boundaries of where employees of MVP, its agents, or contractors can work? Let me read this again. I'm actually going to paraphrase this because I think I can say it in a way that will probably make more sense. I think what the question is trying to ask is, how are our police officers going to understand where the actual project right-of-way is and where the contractor's workers are supposed to be relative to people's property? How are we going to know when they're in the right place? That's what I think this question is trying to get at.
Understand that we are not surveyors, and we will not be able to make precise determinations about where a line is or isn't. What we have communicated to EQT is that they should, in the course of their setup of their construction, have some readily visible marking, whether that's a sediment fence or one of those orange snow fences that you see sometimes, something that essentially establishes where their construction site is. Now, honestly, a police officer is not going to have any way of knowing whether that fence, if that's what they would use, is in the right place or if it's a foot or two off. We're not surveyors. So that is going to be a challenge. We've asked them, again, to try to do some marking so we can at least make a decision based on that. But that may be an area where an individual property owner that might have an issue with where MVP is doing something would have to go through a civil process around whether they are or aren't constructing where they're supposed to.
And I think that's also an area where, and again, these are things we don't know, but this is one of these processes that can be done very well or done very poorly. So I think if the company takes that responsibility seriously and tries to make it very clear where the lines are on the ground and they survey it properly, that should minimize that issue. If it's just a few stakes and paint dots on the ground, that's going to make that very difficult. We've strongly encouraged them to make this very clear because we think that'll make the situation better for all parties involved. I agree with Howard. I think orange fence is probably the best way to do that. If a citizen is unable to resolve an issue relating to this, again, we don't have surveyors that work for the county, but if I come out and look at something that clearly looks wrong, I'll call the company, call FERC, try to help you. But all of us are really going to be relying on that survey professional because the exhibits and documents that are in the eminent domain proceedings and even on the FERC filings, there's really not enough landmarks on those for somebody just to go out and say, okay, it's this far from this tree or something like that, that the plans just aren't made in that way. So it's really the surveyor that's going to establish those lines. The county is not going to be involved in any survey activity. We don't have surveyors. We're not going to hire surveyors to try to locate this project any more than we would for somebody building a home. That's really up to, just like it would be for anybody doing any kind of activity. The person causing the work to happen is responsible for ensuring that it's surveyed correctly and is located correctly on the ground. And that is not something that we as a county regulate for, any type of project. Next question. Is law enforcement ready to protect the landowners when MVP, its agents, or contractors trespass on non-easement property?
Well, again, our approach to trespassing on any property is if someone's there and they leave either before we get there or at our direction, we're done. We don't, as a police department, proceed after that. An individual property owner, again, whether it's related to the pipeline or a private business or any place else, may choose on their own to go to the magistrate and ask for charges. And again, we're not going to be in a position to determine precisely where easements or boundary lines are in these situations. We would be looking for more of the blatant type of activity that's clearly not where it's supposed to be. And if our officers respond to something like that, they will ask the person or people, if they believe they're someplace that they don't belong, to leave.
Okay, next question, and I just let everybody know I'm going to try to go through these reasonably quickly because we do have quite a few of them, and if folks do have follow-up afterwards, we'd be happy to go into any of these in more detail. What is the landowner's liability if an employee of MVP or contractors is injured within the easement corridor, and what is the landowner's liability if an employee of MVP or its contractors are injured outside of the easement corridor? I am not an attorney, but I just can't imagine a scenario where, unless the property owner took some specific action to hurt a pipeline worker, where they're going to be responsible for an injury or accident that happens within the easement. I think that the company is responsible for the safety of its workers and getting them to and from the site safely. And they have an easement, well, in this case, I guess they will, if the judge sides in their favor, they would have an easement to construct across somebody's property, but at that point in time, they become responsible for that easement and how they do their work. So even though you're still the underlying landowner, and this would really be no different than any other type of utility that somebody may have near them. So that is not, if I were a landowner, that's probably not a worry that I would have. I'd probably have a lot of other ones, but it would not probably be this one. How will county assure that ingress and egress to their property is maintained during active construction? This is a very important issue. I think, as Howard mentioned earlier, one of the things that you can't do is block people's access. That applies to somebody that might want to stop the work, but it also applies to the people doing the work. So I think for a whole variety of reasons that people are going to have to be able to get to and from their property, their homes at all times. That's important to us from a public safety perspective. Obviously, it's important to the resident, and we're going to do everything possible to make sure that's always the case. So you should never not be able to get to your home. The only scenario I can think of is there may be some properties that are bisected by the actual project to where there probably would be times where you might have to go around the other way. But that's also, I think, an issue that is a court issue, really, with respect to what the easement actually is, how much it should cost, and what the impact was to the property owner. So that's something that's, again, outside of our purview. But as far as ingress and egress to your homes, to businesses, to you being able to get to work and those kind of things, that's something that's going to be very important to us. What mitigation is expected of MVP if construction has begun and is then halted or stopped due to court rulings? That's a question that I'm going to have to not answer tonight because I don't know the answer to. Ultimately, that's going to be FERC causing things to be restored, but as you saw in those pictures, you can't put a tree back together, but also I don't think you can just leave a half-finished pipeline. I did see pictures of one over the weekend. There was a segment on CBS with a pipeline project that actually has been stopped. I think it's up in Pennsylvania. So that's something I'll look into more. I had not contemplated that question, so I think that's an excellent question. What chemicals are expected to be used to keep easements clear of vegetation? I don't know specific chemicals. I do know that in most of its filings, MVP has indicated that it did not plan to use chemicals. It was going to use mechanical methods. Interestingly, the Forest Service wants chemicals to be used on the easements through the National Forest, which was a surprise to me, but Their reasoning for that is they're very concerned about invasive species. And then I saw some later filings where they said they would only use chemicals at the request of the property owner, which in that case was the Forest Service or presumably an individual. So I'll look into that more, but unless they have changed their mind or filed something else, it was our understanding they were planning to do this mechanically and not through chemicals, which I think is probably what most people want, but it sounds like there's some flexibility there, and FERC allows both, but has a preference for mechanical means of clearing. And the last question on this sheet is, due to the high amount of water crossings, wetlands, and close proximities of creeks that the pipe will be laid, what steps will the county take to protect the waters from contamination? This is where we are going to need to work closely with DEQ. One thing that we're considering, our board has not acted on yet, is entering into an agreement with DEQ so that our staff can work more closely with them to try to help with issues like this. This really is where one of our largest concerns has always been, which is water quality, and that's heightened when you are actually crossing streams and rivers and creeks. So I see us being probably more involved in those type of issues than other types, because a couple reasons. First, it's something that we regulate anyway ourselves. We have expertise. We have the right kind of staff. So I think that we're better able to help with this issue than, say, for example, to answer a question about liability if somebody's hurt. So all excellent questions, and I'm going to hand Amy this, and she's going to hand me some more. Okay, will there be 24/7 fire or rescue on Bent Mountain if the project happens? I'll let Chief Simon speak to that one.
There's currently 24/7 fire rescue on Bent Mountain. During the daylight hours, it is staffed by county career personnel, meaning paid staff. During the evening hours, it's staffed by volunteers. We have full paid staff, 24-hour staff at the Back Creek Station. And since this pipeline is coming through the county also, at our Fort Lewis Station, we do have 24/7 fire rescue.
Okay, next two questions are for Chief Hall. Has Roanoke County hired more police? And then the second part of the question, no police help in trespass disputes. How do you know if it's criminal or not until you investigate?
The answer to the first question is easy, no. With the same number of police officers that we have had. In terms of trespassing, as I said before, we handle trespass complaints somewhat routinely for a variety of reasons. We generally do not do follow-up investigations on those. If the person trespassing is no longer present when we get there, there's nothing further to investigate. If a person is present and we determine that they are in fact trespassing, our officers generally ask them to leave. If they leave, then the officer is not generally going to charge them. That doesn't prevent a citizen from going to the magistrate again and doing that. Obviously, if there is the same individual who continues repeatedly to trespass and come back essentially after we're done, we may take a different approach with that individual.
And I will say the one caveat to this, and this is getting back to what's really a technical challenge and a jurisdictional challenge. If there's a dispute, for example, over the survey, where you would again need a professional surveyor to come in and determine where things really are, that's not a service that we are set up to provide, and that is going to ultimately be a matter that ends up in the courts. And particularly when eminent domain is used, and I know many of you are probably familiar with this, but oftentimes the work has taken place before those proceedings end up in court, so there is actually a venue to raise a number of those issues before a judge, even though they've happened in the past. So again, we're going to try to help as much as we can, but that is a resource that we do not have. Next question is, will Roanoke... Okay, and with that, and I'll probably err in allowing that one, because we have so many of these written questions, this will be the one and only follow-up I'll acknowledge until we've finished with all the written questions. But that is ultimately, like a lot of these, that has to be a matter for a judge to decide. We have police officers, we have engineers, but we do not have that judicial authority that you need to resolve an issue where you have two professional experts that are in disagreement, or a homeowner in disagreement with an expert. And I'll give the example of, your neighbor cuts down the tree that you think is on your land, and the two of you disagree on where the property line is. While that's just not an issue that can be resolved really outside a court proceeding, because even if we thought you were right, we don't really have any authority to do anything about it. And there's many things that work like that. Next question, I think actually this is a little different. Will Roanoke County Police or the sheriff accompany inspectors for the construction site? And I assume this could be inspectors from DEQ or Roanoke County. If they had to report to the site, would the police come with them?
If we got a request from a state or federal or local inspector for assistance, and we get those now from time to time for various reasons, then we try to accommodate that. If it's something that the company is doing, again, we communicate to the company that the security of their project is their responsibility.
And this next question, I believe, has already been answered, but I want to read it again just so you know we're reading all your questions. Please explain the process of how Roanoke County police officers may be allowed to moonlight as extra security for MVP, and the chief has already indicated that they will not be able to do that. Also for you, Chief Hall, do you know who the security contractors or companies will be for the contractor?
Not yet. I anticipate that there'll probably be some local security companies subcontracted to do it, but we don't know who they are at this point.
Okay, when do you anticipate getting a precise alignment of the pipeline, and how will that information be communicated to the public? And there's another question here that's unrelated, so I'll answer this first one. One of the things that I think that we have done that I think has probably been the single most helpful thing to citizens is mapping of the project. Roanoke County does have a pretty robust GIS system. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. And every time we get updated information about the physical characteristics of the project on the ground, we update that GIS website so that you can see how this affects your property. I want to stress that our GIS system is not intended to be as accurate as a professional surveyor doing a ground survey. And it's probably slightly less accurate in some of the areas that have the real heavy topography just by the nature of how it works. That being said, it's pretty darn good and a whole lot better than anything else. So we have just gone through a process of taking what were labeled as final plans for construction, loading those into our GIS site, and that is the most accurate view that I have of the project. Again, I want to stress, just like if I look at my own home in GIS, the property line in GIS is off by a few feet because I know where the pin is. But it's far better than trying to look at the actual plans that are filed with FERC and trying to figure out how that lays on your property. If you ever see that and you think it looks incorrect for you, let me know and I'll work with our GIS staff to see if we've made any mistakes. But we have excellent GIS folks, and if you follow the link that we gave you on the card tonight, one of the buttons actually takes you to the most recent map, and you can search your name, you can search your address, and it'll pull up your parcel. So we're continuing to do that. We've been doing that since day one, and we think that's probably the single best thing that we did to help folks see how the project would affect the county. Steve, next one I think is, Chief Hall, for you. Does the fire marshal have the authority to stop construction until the MVP provides all the promised documents relating to and regarding public safety?
For a burn permit or a blast permit, there is a set procedure that the applicant has to go through, and they need to meet all the requirements of that. If they do not have a burn permit, then they're not going to be allowed to be able to burn without our permission, per se, that they've gone through all the steps. Some of that might have to do on the right-of-way, if they don't have enough area, and it also depends on what type of method they're going to burn. Typically, large-scale projects like this use what they call a pit burn, where they are able to go ahead and burn basically very hot temperature by injecting air, and this is why they normally do land clearing, and then that is permitted. However, there has to be certain boundaries that they have to meet. So our fire marshal, one of our deputy fire marshals will go out, inspect the property of where they're going to go ahead and do the burn, and I think in one of the slides that you saw where they have the stumps, They usually will pile that up into a pile, and that's where they like to burn it. If that's not acceptable to meet a safety standard, we will not issue them a burn permit. Then they would have to come up with some other reason, some other method to go ahead and utilize the debris removal. We have asked, they have taken our permits, both blast permits and burn permits, but they have not told me or told our staff what their intention is on what they're going to do with any of the debris that they clear.
I would speak to a larger question. I think this sort of the question behind the question this is getting at. Ultimately, the county has very limited authority just to stop all work on the project due to a problem. That's something where if there was an issue that we thought warranted that, we would have to get FERC to issue a general stop work order on the project. They have that authority. There's currently a bill in the General Assembly trying to give the state some limited authority in that arena for E&S type issues. I don't know how that bill will fare in the Assembly this year, but the county can't just go tell the company just stop all work until you fix a particular issue. I do think we could stop blasting or burning since we would be the permitting people for those, but say for example there's an erosion and sediment issue where the county would normally issue a stop work order. If we were the permit authority, we're going to have to get DEQ or FERC or somebody else involved to try to cause that to happen. But again, I think that's an important role that we have, even if we're not the direct authority, because it's probably very helpful to a citizen to have us call FERC in addition to the citizen call FERC if there's a problem of that magnitude, and we would want to do that. Next question, and we've spoken to some, but this question is a little different. FERC estimates hundreds of workers will enter our community for up to 1 year to build a pipeline. How will you ensure the safety of school-aged and high school-aged children traveling in the Cave Spring community when pipeline workers enter our community? Howard, do you want to talk a little bit about that just from a general safety perspective?
What we know is that the potential is at the peak 800 workers. We don't know who they are. I'm told that these are relatively well-paid people in terms of the specialty work that they do. They'll obviously have to live someplace while they're here. In the Cave Spring area, immediately, there really aren't that many hotel resources for them. We would anticipate them staying, those that want to camp in lawful campgrounds, which there are very few of in Roanoke County, or hotels someplace. And we'll respond to calls for service just like we would any other incident if something occurs.
Okay, and the last question I had in that batch I had in my hand, again, I think it's been spoken to before, but it's about people being able to get to work, get to school, go up and down Benton Mountain, people who travel the roads daily. Again, and this is something where if that ever happens to you where you can't get where you want to go, let us know immediately. We will do everything possible to try to resolve that, because I'm just not aware of any type of construction that is allowed to essentially trap people in their homes or prevent people from getting to their homes. And that's something where we will very aggressively pursue that with both the company and with FERC, because that's just something that shouldn't happen. And there's definitely going to need to be some planning done by the company, and we are providing them this information with bus routes and things of that nature, where they know if they take a truckload of pipe up Honeysuckle Road that nobody else is probably going to be able to come down while they're going up. So we would want them to plan that so they don't encounter the school bus or the trash truck. That doesn't mean that a citizen might not have to wait a few minutes for the truck to pass, but we want them doing those kind of things outside of hours where they would cause the most effect. That's another area where we can also work with VDOT. So the next question, I think these are all going to be about environmental issues, so I'll probably be answering a lot of these. Is the erosion and sediment study complete? And isn't Roanoke County concerned that MVP's analysis of impacts to Roanoke River didn't include the sediment that will come from Bottom Creek and the South Fork area, and will Spring Hollow be offline? Roanoke County, this is ultimately regulated and governed by DEQ. Roanoke County did not independently go through an analysis to try to ensure that all of MVP's calculations were correct. And part of the reason for that is A, we were not the regulator, and B, we do not have the resources to have checked. I mean, anybody who's tried to look at it, there's probably hundreds of thousands of documents that have been filed in the project, some of them with very detailed engineering calculations. So ultimately, we are relying on DEQ to do that correctly. I do know the DEQ hired an engineering firm, and I think they were spending about $2.5 million to do plan review on the project. We have looked at some of their review work that appeared to be relatively robust. As far as Spring Hollow is, by the nature of how it works, the Water Authority is able to turn intake from the river on or off depending on water conditions in the river, and they do that on an ongoing basis anyway. So after a big rain, if the river gets more turbid, they don't pump into the reservoir until the water clears up a little bit. But they do that all the time based on the quality of the water in the river on an ongoing basis. So they are able to control that, which is, that's not the standard reservoir setup. So in some sense, that's actually a very good thing that the reservoir functions the way that it does, because it gives it a level of protection that most reservoirs don't have. Because most reservoirs are in a low place and water runs down to them. Spring Hollow is in a very high place and water's pumped up into it. So it's not in the immediate watershed of the project itself. That was one of the early changes that was made to the route that we pushed really hard for, was to get it out of the area where direct runoff from the project would go straight into the reservoir. It is certainly affected by the watershed of the Roanoke River, but they do have the ability to control that. That's another area that we put a lot of emphasis on with FERC, was trying to make sure that the crossing was done correctly to avoid problems. On Poor Mountain, stream crossings will include a lot of blasting due to the bedrock. Will neighboring property be notified when they do this? Part of blasting is you do have to notify people in a certain radius before you do your activity. And in particular, if you're doing blasting work near wells, blasting is a very heavily regulated activity. And Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but that's part of our role in the blasting process, is making sure that they have a blasting plan and there's criteria for notifications and other things.
That's correct. What we call, when they blast, it's a shot. So typically they're going to drill a bore down into the ground, and they're trying to disrupt the ground where they can dig it out. So it's not the type of blast that you're going to see where it's a big explosion, rocks shooting super high up in the air. Whenever they are going to be doing blasting, one of our deputy fire marshals or fire marshal will be, and they'll inspect it prior to the blast. More than likely, they will use a local contractor that will do the blasting for them, and we have good working relationships with those individuals. They know that they need to follow those rules very specifically, or we will not allow them to blast. So whenever they are doing blasting, like I said, they might do multiple shots throughout the day. We'll go ahead and have to sign off on pretty much all of their shots before they do that. And those considerations to make sure other people are not in a danger zone, it wouldn't impact other people's property based on the current regulations. We take all those things into consideration, and then our fire marshal would give them approval to go ahead and do those, that per se blasting. But it's just not a free hand. They just do whatever they want per se. It is a very regulated, more so than most other activities that we deal with from the fire department.
Next question is kind of related to this, is who will collect wild trout before blasting occurs in the streams? Who will make sure that this is done? VMRC said that this will be the protocol. That's not something that we regulate, but if it does involve blasting, that's certainly something that we can look into with VMRC and see how they normally coordinate that. I have only limited experience with blasting and fish, but I do know that in the blasting work that I've been involved with, it was around water. There were some requirements for fish and how you protected them. I'm not familiar with it for trout, but that's a good question that we'll need to look into more. But one thing, just maybe as a reminder to everybody, this project is going to unfold over a period of time. So these are the types of questions that one of the reasons we're glad we're here tonight, that we can collect and try to look into more before that actually becomes an eventuality, to see, is there a role for us, who's doing it, and how does it work? This is an excellent question, actually, and I'm glad somebody asked it. So your pictures show trenching through dirt on Poor Mountain and Bid Mountain. It'll be on steep slopes with shallow bedrock, a lot of blasting. Who will monitor the inevitable erosion? scattering seeds won't work and saplings won't take place on solid rock, who will monitor the erosion. That is an excellent point. I couldn't find pictures of pipelines that looked like they went through. I was trying to find the stuff I thought looked as close as it did to us, but there's not a good parallel project I could find. And that's one of the concerns that we've raised as a county, is that I don't know that anybody's built a 42-inch natural gas pipeline through rugged terrain in the Appalachian Mountains. So I didn't do it to try to sugarcoat it. I did it because through the extensive use of Google, I couldn't find anything that looked quite like that. It is a good point. I will say that I think that there will be a lot of blasting on Bent Mountain and Poor Mountain, especially on Poor Mountain. And, if it's just in solid rock, that limits some of the erosion issues. But again, as whoever wrote this question suggests, getting that reestablishment is going to be a very difficult, time-consuming, and expensive operation. I used to work in the highway world. It was always a challenge working in the mountains, trying to get vegetation reestablished. It can be done, but it often doesn't happen on the first attempt, and it takes a lot of follow-up, and it's very, very tedious work. So again, that's something where I think the county can be a big help, because we do have some expertise in this, and it's something that is definitely going to be on our radar screen. What measures will be used to monitor or offset cleanup or water contamination during and after construction? Again, that is primarily going to be under DEQ's jurisdiction, but that's something where, again, at least I believe we're going to bring before the board an agreement that we can enter into with DEQ to work with them. But ultimately, DEQ has the regulatory authority, and they have a lot of tools they can use to require folks to clean up their mess, so to speak. But quite frankly, the real goal is to try to avoid that from happening to start with, because it's a lot easier to avoid problems than it is to try to fix them. But that's where I think, again, we'll be heavily involved. Who will monitor construction and who is responsible? Ultimately, this is a FERC process. So FERC has an inspection apparatus. They have a reporting apparatus. They are the primary regulator. So they are the ones, for example, inspecting the wells and making sure that's done properly, which is very important for all of us. That's ultimately under FERC's purview. And they have, again, their own inspection apparatus. In theory, they also do the same thing for erosion and sediment control. They have direct authority, but that's also where they allow the state to take a role if they want it, and Virginia has certainly decided to take that role. But at the end of the day, the FERC has really all of the authority for those types of issues. Will construction be stopped if there are serious violations? I think FERC certainly can do that. And depending on the nature of the issue, that is something that we could certainly request that they do. And I do think a request coming from a local government carries a lot of weight. What guarantee is there for just compensation to be paid for owners whose land and lives are being destroyed? Ultimately, as like everybody's aware, in this case, I guess it's the federal courts ultimately, adjudicate the right-of-way issues and determine value. Not a lawyer, not an expert in that process. I know it's a lengthy process, but that is supposed to look at, it's beyond just the value of the actual land. It's also supposed to look at what damage happened to what was left. So in theory, it's supposed to be a pretty encompassing settlement. Roanoke County is not directly involved in that, but that's ultimately decided by a judge, and that's likely to happen quite some time into the future. What measures will What measures will be taken to prevent contamination of the river and Spring Hollow Reservoir? I talked about that before. Unfortunately, I guess from our perspective, they are planning to open cut the Roanoke River. We requested that they evaluate boring the river, and we made a number of filings to FERC making that request. But it's our understanding their plan is to divert the river and open trench the river probably during the summer when the flow is lower. The primary protection for the reservoir is the quality of that work that's done, but then probably more importantly, their ability to manage when they take water out of the river, which is, again, unusual that we have that set up, but That is really the best protection that the reservoir has. If the water quality is low, they stop pumping. Obviously, they can only do that for so long because, ultimately, if no water goes in, the reservoir goes dry, but they can go for, extended periods of time without pumping, which sometimes they have to do due to low flow in the river anyway. So that's something that I think there's tools to manage, but that would be important to us. I will say that actual crossing is in Montgomery County. So we probably won't be involved in quite the same way as we would if it was in Roanoke County, but even though it's not in our county, we've been very focused on that. How will citizens know their water is safe? What if it's determined if the water is no longer safe? Who is responsible? What limit liability company that's known today is Mountain Valley Pipeline LLC dissolves the corporation who will be held accountable? This is a concern that we share. We requested that DEQ require bonding for this for that very reason. Ultimately, the water authority is responsible. If you're on public water, they have to meet requirements for the water they provide to their customers. And again, they have a variety of means to do that. But at the end of the day, the company is responsible for any damage that it causes. And certainly this is a risk that, again, would be critical to the community, very important to the county. But again, fortunately, there's some ways to control this that are not always the norm. This is Roanoke County Fire and Rescue. Let me see. Oh, okay. And I don't know how to pronounce this chemical name, but I know what the question is. Basically, if we asked for them to put the chemical that gives gas its smell into the gas so that folks would know that the pipe is leaking because they smell the leak.
You would possibly smell the leak. On this size pipe, if there was a leak, it's going to be a very high pressurized one. You're going to, where it's probably remotely at, you probably wouldn't smell it because that's usually just a general area right where eyesight. So if it is a large leak, their detection systems, from my understanding, will see a drop in their pressure, and that's how they go out and notice it. This is extremely high pressure. It would probably be more of a whistling sound if it was a leak. But we have not experienced this size pipeline in Roanoke County, so it's a little bit different. Most of the pipelines that we have are gas, actually liquid gas, and usually when you have a leak in those, you would see discoloration on the ground because the vegetation dies. But typically a high pressure line, you're going to hear it whistling at this capacity.
And this is the question that I would like to do a little more research into, and I actually saw this issue on the segment I saw on CBS that was talking about the project in Pennsylvania with the issue of the gas not having the added smell yet, which is an additive, not the inherent smell of the gas. I don't know how that's regulated, but I'd like to find out more about it because it's a good question. I just don't know, the full answer of if and how that's done, when it's transmitted at sort of in the transmission pipe versus distribution.
We do have gas detectors on our apparatus, so if there was a smell in the area or if there was a suspected leak of the gas, even though there's not a smell to you or to a person, we would have gas detectors that we could check to see if there was any type of gas leaking. That is a common occurrence. We go out on gas leaks on a regular basis. It's not uncommon for contractors to hit natural gas lines in neighborhoods or someone that uses propane to hit a gas line. Obviously, those are residential gas lines. Some of them are larger pipe, but they're nowhere near as big as this one. Something like this, you're going to hear more of a whistling sound coming out. It's going to be extremely high pressure. When it breaks the surface, ma'am, that's the only way you would go ahead and hear or smell if it came out.
Steve, next question is for you too. Does the fire marshal attend all blasting? What is the notification process?
The fire marshal or deputy fire marshal has to sign off on all shots. As I mentioned, a shot is when they actually do a blast. That's where they drill down into the ground, they put explosive charges, and then when they detonate that, that's considered a shot. So they might do multiple shots throughout a project. We will have a fire marshal that goes ahead and inspects where they're going to do the shots prior to having them detonated, and then in this case, we'll probably have a fire marshal monitoring it. Once again, the likelihood is that they will be using local contractors that that do most blasting in Southwest Virginia. We have a very good working relationship with those individuals in the sense that they know what the regulations are. They don't deviate from that. Records have to be kept in case there is a problem, but our fire marshals will be monitoring that very closely. I anticipate they're going to blast, but they have not told us they're going to blast. But if you know that terrain, you're probably going to have to use some type of blasting material.
Okay, next question I can take. How will you know about sediment levels that are very high in the absence of an accident or spill? And I need to follow up with them to see where they are with this, but I know DEQ was evaluating the idea of actually installing monitoring equipment in a number of the water bodies to measure water quality in real time, which would help with that. This is another area, though, where in addition to the two inspectors that would be on the spread who would be checking these kind of things, where citizens could help if they saw something that was concerning, and that's an area where we can coordinate with DEQ and make sure that gets looked at quickly. Most cases of erosion in the county are things that the person inspecting that land disturbing activity detects. But in this case, particularly given the terrain and just where folks live, that is something we would definitely want you to call us about so we can make sure it gets looked at. So, if project's going on upstream and I see muddy water, I think that's going to need to be looked at to make sure that that's not a problem. Chief Hall, this last one is for you on this card. Sexual assaults increase in areas with pipeline construction of this magnitude. Have pertinent groups been alerted to this? And it just talks about different women's groups, school nurses, et cetera.
Again, we don't know the actual people that are coming for this project. We will deal with any criminal allegation just as we deal with criminal allegations that we receive today. If a crime's committed, we will make every effort to identify who is responsible and bring the appropriate criminal charges. At this point, we haven't had any liaisons with any particular groups over this issue.
Next item, I think we've already answered this, but just so that we share all the questions. This is another question about what happens if there's heavy sediment in the river and how does the reservoir cope with that? And again, the short answer is they stop pumping until that issue is resolved. But again, I'm really, this is actually, the questions have been excellent, and these are, many of these questions are the very questions we have raised with the regulatory agencies ourselves, because they're wonderful questions. Will the county or DEQ monitor the impacts of rare endangered species on the pipeline route? In particular, I'm concerned about the habitat of, this is a creature on Bottom Creek. I'm not sure what it is, I'm not good with my Latin. If so, how would that occur? Again, DEQ is in the driver's seat with respect to these issues, and we're going to assist them in any way possible. However, the county does not directly regulate the endangered and threatened species issues. I will say that in the federal process, in the NEPA process and the FERC process, threatened and endangered species are actually treated very sensitively, probably relative to some of the other issues. And in some ways, we've seen more responsiveness when we've raised these types of issues than we have, quite frankly, some of the bigger issues like the reservoir. But their processes are geared to this. So I actually expect there will probably be more scrutiny to that than some of the other things that might cause us community concern. But if somebody has particular knowledge of a species that's in their area or something that we should get people to look at that you think is going to be overlooked, we'll certainly point the right people in that direction. But the one example I will use for this that seems to be the most important thing right now to the company are the issues with the threatened and endangered bats and birds and the time restriction. There's also time restrictions for fish. And I know that the company seems to be trying to build its schedule around that from its legal filings. Again, they haven't told me things about their schedule, but there does appear to be a fairly strong regulatory system for that. And again, we will help make sure that that's enforced to the best of our ability. Who will be responsible for the environmental degradation that will occur as a result of the project? And I'm going to go ahead and just read the whole card. Since the MVP will cross the Blue Ridge Parkway, who or what organization is responsible for protecting one of our greatest tourist attractions? The first question was very general with respect to protecting the environment. That's really several different people, but again, For Virginia, it's primarily DEQ and FERC, where we have mostly played our role by trying to raise issues and concerns with them about environmental. That's really what the bulk of our work has been with water quality. The Blue Ridge Parkway, that is in the county. It's obviously a significant concern of ours. That's managed a little bit differently because the National Park Service is a federal agency. So they have a different relationship with FERC than we do. I do know from some of my earliest contacts with the company that from what they told me, they really planned the entire project around trying to cross the parkway at Abney Gap. They wanted to cross there because there's very few trees there. And so to them, and actually to the Park Service, that was minimizing the impact because they went through an area that wasn't wooded. What I don't think that they really maybe thought about is, to us, that was the prettiest place on the parkway because it was the one place that looked different, and so it's very special to everybody. So I do think from what I've seen in the regulatory process that federal lands actually seem to get a higher level of protection than everything else, which is positive. And FERC has a little different relationship with the sister federal agency than it does with us. But you're absolutely right. It's a great question. It's something that we really want to watch and see how that's done. But the Park Service ultimately, I think within reason, told FERC where to cross. So they actually moved the originally proposed crossing to a different place at Abney Gap, and that's something that those two federal agencies and the company worked through. But I couldn't agree more with the sentiment of the question, that tourism and the importance of the parkway is very important to the county. Laydown yards and information meetings. Will there be a laydown yard in Roanoke County? If so, will there be a zoning change? Can't you just insist on knowing where they plan on putting them? Unfortunately, I can't, because that is outside of the FERC process, and they have no obligation to tell us. Unless it's going to be in the county, they have to go through a rezoning process. So, for example, if there was a site that already had proper zoning, which there's really not that many in the county I could think of, but if they wanted to use a site that had existing zoning and was already properly zoned for that use, they could do it without getting separate permission from the county. However, there's not land that I'm aware of that meets that description near the route in the county. If they did anything on land that wasn't already zoned, they'd have to go through the planning commission, through the board. That's a fairly lengthy process, and they have not initiated that, which tells me that they're very unlikely to be considering that. I do think that our neighboring counties in some areas have less strict requirements, so there may not be one of these in Roanoke County. We don't know yet, but in the absence of any obligation they have to tell us, we've asked them, and we're going to keep asking, and at some point, if it's in the county, even if it was on an area of proper zoning, we would see it. But unfortunately, there's not some rule that causes them to tell us this until they choose to or until we see it. So we're going to keep our eyes open for that. Do you plan on holding more information meetings with any on Bent Mountain, the major impact zone? We actually looked at doing this tonight on Bent Mountain, and the reason that we had it here, and when we see who actually attended, we could have done somewhere different. We didn't know how many people were going to come, and we wanted to really try to do it before February 1st, so we ended up here just to try to accommodate whoever wanted to come. I've done a number of both formal and informal meetings with citizens. I know that we will be, it may not look exactly like this, but we'll be doing more things in the future with the community as the project moves forward. I think that's in some ways, given our absence of direct control, the most important thing that we've done through the project is actually try to talk to people and keep them informed. I've also encouraged, and I don't know if they'll do it, I really think that the company should do a lot of outreach to the community about their plans. They should tell you where the staging area is going to be and how they're going to go about their work, because I think it would be better if they did that themselves. But if they don't take that on, that's one of the things that we plan to do with our website. And I actually like to talk to people in person. So while we don't have another meeting scheduled yet, I could easily see us doing either something else like this again or something similar, because this is a good way for us to try to tell people what we know. And again, this is another question about adding the chemical to the gas for leak detection. I promise I'll look into that more because I saw the thing for the first time this morning that really talked through that issue, and I don't know that much about technically what's done. Oh, yeah, that's my understanding too, but what I don't know is, are there examples where that's been required that we could ask? And that's where I want to do a little homework, but very good question. Okay, this question is about, will Mountain Valley Pipeline be required to repair all of the access roads that they use during construction? I think that's going to vary depending on what they are. There's several different types of access roads on the project. There's temporary ones, there's permanent ones. There's some that are completely new roads that hook up to an existing state road, but they don't follow the path of a road that's already there. There are some of them that basically follow people's driveways and go behind their homes. There's a variety of types of roads. Ultimately, FERC is going to regulate what kind of shape that they're in during construction, but I would say that if you have an access road on your property that you have to use to get to and from your home, which is going to be the case for a number of residents in the county, and it's not being kept in a reasonable shape that you can get to and from your home in a reasonable fashion, let us know. We'll do everything we can to help you because, again, I just think that's a kind of contractor 101, any kind of construction obligation that you have is to keep that in good shape for somebody. And it's a very real question because, you saw all the big stuff they need to move around, and you're trying to use your car. Well, your car is not a heavy-duty off-road piece of construction equipment, and so there's going to have to be work done to make sure that the roads are always usable for normal people driving their normal vehicles. VDOT has a role if it's a state road, but a lot of this is going to be private. But if you have an issue with that you can't resolve, let me know. That's my background. I'm a road person, sort of by education, and I'll be glad to help you any way I can. And whether that's talk to FERC or talk to the company, because that should be kept in a way that's easily passable, that doesn't hurt your car, and make sure you have access to your home. Will they be held accountable, and on what timeline? FERC does have a process they use to manage their contracts and their contractors. I am not intimately familiar with all the things that they do during construction, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be working on. Is we're kind of transitioning now from Roanoke County still making filings in the regulatory process related to the ongoing approval, but now, as you can see, we're kind of shifting gears to, if it does come, what will you do? And this is an area that I want to learn more about that I don't know as much about tonight as I'd like to, but learn more about how FERC actually manages projects, and that's something else we can post information on as we learn it. What if VDOT paved a road already, but VDOT has no current responsibility to maintain the road? Who is responsible for repairing the road degradation that will inevitably occur if the pipeline moves forward? Roanoke County worked with Delegate Habib last General Assembly session to try to, and got a piece of legislation passed that actually required the company to enter into an agreement with VDOT regarding repair of damage to roads. That was a concern we had as a county. So that's ultimately VDOT's responsibility, but there was some legislation to try to help them with that we supported. So again, I think that's just like the erosion issue, something that we will be working with over a relatively long period of time. But if you do have problems and you start to see them, let us know. We'll let VDOT know and work with you to try to resolve that. Will citizens' rights to access recreation sites and participate in activities, i.e. hunting, fishing, swimming, be restricted during the years when the construction is underway? That's ultimately governed by either the agreement that somebody entered into with the company or the court order that comes out with the eminent domain proceedings. And it's something that we've been discussing internally with respect to, what exact rights are conveyed when that happens. And it's a good question. What effect would that have on things happening next door? So we're going to be very interested to see if there's a judicial order granting eminent domain, what all criteria are in there, because that's really where you have to look to see what restrictions that you would have as a property owner, because if you're the underlying landowner, you still own the land the whole time, but generally speaking, there's restrictions on what you can do during the period of construction and operation, and that's all laid out in the judicial order. So we have a lot of interest in that, and we're going to be reading that as that's available, if that does come to pass. And that's really where that language is going to be. But if I can say it this way, though, if it's not in the judicial order or an agreement with somebody has, unless it's a requirement or restriction the county otherwise has, there isn't one. So the restriction has to come from somewhere. It can't just be, kind of dreamt up. So that's where we all have to look at the court rulings. Okay, who will ensure that the workers have the appropriate permits? It lists burn, welding, size of trucks, etc. Different aspects of that are regulated by different people. So, for example, with blasting, since we're issuing the blasting permit, that's where we have to see you're a certified blaster, you have the right training, because we're the permit issuer. VDOT and DMV, really DMV is a primary regulator for oversized loads, so that goes through them. Welding, I don't know, other than to say that falls under FERC. See, anything related to the actual quality of the product from a pipeline perspective is all FERC. So they make sure it's the right size pipe, right type of metal, the welds are right. That's 100% their baby during construction. And in this particular case, not something that we otherwise have expertise in. So as far as those type of things, it's going to be different regulators will regulate different aspects of that during construction. Okay, Roanoke County has permitting authority to help write floodplain ordinance. Does Roanoke County have a draft ordinance to show the public and floodplain maps? Roanoke County is involved in floodplain related regulations. However, we're not aware of anywhere the pipeline impacts any of our regulated floodplains. I think this question comes out of, in Nelson County, there's been a lot of interest and activity over floodplain regulation where, I haven't looked into it myself, but I think the pipeline may be crossing a different type of area where there perhaps is regulated floodplain. May even be happening in places close to us in Virginia, but in Roanoke County, we're in very high places on the watershed, so all those we have a lot of concerns about ENS issues and things of that nature. There's really not delineated or today regulated floodplain in that area, so that is not something that we've had that question asked of us, but that is not something that we are doing anything from a regulatory perspective at the moment. Okay, how much is the county going to make from MVP? Okay, I think the second question is unrelated, so I'll answer that the first. Local governments do receive revenue from infrastructure projects like the pipeline. How much we get is determined by the Department of Taxation. We have no say in it, and we have no choice in what we get. So the same rules that apply to assets of the railroad, existing pipelines. So there is, in theory, when it's all said and done, some tax revenue that we receive based on the value of the asset. We don't know exactly what that'll end up being, and quite frankly, we have not made any plans around that yet because, I hate to say it this way, but we'll believe it when we see it, what the number actually is. Whatever the number is, it's likely to go down fairly rapidly as the pipe is depreciated monetarily. And we have always taken the position with the project that we felt like the impacts were more than offset any revenue that we would gain because we're worried about the impacts. So if we end up at the end of the day with any additional revenue, we don't know what that'll be because it could be offset by things that reduce our revenue. And until sort of the dust settles with all that, you really have to look at it holistically. So for example, if someone's home was worth less because of the project, well, we tax their home too. And you have to look at any gain that you make on the value of the pipe might be offset by other things that happen. If it is a net, any net new money for us, it's likely to be relatively small in the overall scheme of our budget. Again, this is probably different than some other counties that the two projects in Virginia cross, but we're relatively urban, relatively large county, and so whatever it is not a big make or break thing for us, and we've never looked at it from that term. So, and if anything, if you wanted to make money on the project, we should have gone out and said, we really want the long route through the county that was 22 miles long and not the, try to get as much of it out of the county as we could. So we've just never taken that approach. This question is, we own property north of I-81. It appears that we have been forgotten by the county. I can say that we certainly haven't forgotten anybody, and I do know that the pipeline does come close to a number of parcels in the northern part of the county, and I think the rendering you saw there at the end was shot from that perspective. I can say that we've had most interaction with people from the Bent Mountain area, and that's where folks have been talking to us. But if you're from the northern part of the county, you have any interest in the county, I'd be happy to walk you through everything I know, and I want to provide the same level of service to anybody that wants to see me. So we don't look at the pipe any differently, regardless of where it is in the county. I do think that there's just been less probably media focus on that piece right where it kind of goes back into Montgomery, then it tucks back over, barely touches the county line, and then diverts again. I know there's a couple of access roads in that area, so if you are the person, I'd love to meet you. I'd love to come see you. We'll do the same thing that I've done for everybody else that's contacted us. Will Roanoke County adjust property taxes and real estate value degradation due to the pipeline? Let's be honest, real estate values will be impacted. The way that'll work, and I've talked to our real estate assessor's office, we will handle this just like we do all other property in the county. And ultimately, the value of real estate is determined by the market. So if after the pipeline project is finished, our office looks at every real estate transaction in the county. So if property value started to fall, that's going to start to have an effect on our assessment of that property and surrounding properties. But the way we do this in all cases where there's development is you are always doing that after the fact when you see what the actual impact is. And I'll use an example. There was a lot of concern when the Walmart was built out on Challenger Avenue about the effects that would have on surrounding property values. It turned out when you look at it from a real estate assessor's perspective, the changes in value due to the Walmart were very hard to find. It turned out a lot of houses turned over, but the actual sale prices weren't affected very much, and certainly taxation was adjusted in the places where the values changed. But oftentimes the changes are smaller than expected, but quite frankly, and it's a concern that we've expressed as a county, we don't really know the full impact of real estate values that are very close and directly affected by the project. And that is why I say we don't know at the end of the day what it will do to our revenue, because the value to the real estate could be more, could be less, but we will ultimately see that through the market. So really the market will determine what that impact is and how significant it is. As you all have seen, the industry funded a bunch of studies to try to say that would never happen. I'm very skeptical of that, particularly given our terrain, and it was a concern that we have carried throughout the regulatory process, that we were worried that this would have an impact on our property values. When they take our land, will they, okay, it's the same question, and that's that for that stack. Okay. Is Roanoke doing anything to influence the governor, secretary of natural resources, or other powers that be to halt the approval for construction until lawsuits underway are heard and decided by a court of law? We have made a very wide range of filings and pleas and comments to a whole bunch of different parties involved in the project for the whole life of the project. At the moment, we're focusing our efforts on FERC because at the moment, that's where we feel like the most activity is taking place and where we, or at least our council indicates that we have the most likelihood of doing the most good. So over the past week, we've made multiple filings with FERC relating to the notices to proceed that they were first considering and then issued in West Virginia. And even at this point in time, we as a county, don't feel like FERC is following even what it's saying it's doing with respect to those approvals. They were conditioned on a number of factors we don't think the company has shown that they've met. They don't even appear to have been issued by the right people. So at the moment, our issue is, our concerns are primarily directed at the federal government. But throughout the life of the process, or progress, the project, we have sent filings to both the state and the feds. We sent staff to the State Water Control Board meeting to speak on the project. The thing that I can say, though, is I don't think that there is any particular action that our counsel that we've hired to advise us in this process thinks that we can take, and if we just do that, everything will stop. Because ultimately, FERC is issuing all of the approvals, and there just probably isn't something out there that somebody could just go do, and all of a sudden the project would go away or just stop and wait for the court proceedings. That's a legal argument that we have filed. In fact, we made that filing, that we think that it's wrong that some of these things don't have to get resolved up front, but FERC has not agreed with that, and that's an argument I know other parties are making in court. The next two questions I will read, but our county attorney says she would like to speak to. The first one is, can you tell us how many lawsuits are filed or asking for stays or stops of the taking? What legal actions are Roanoke County involved in?
Okay, what's the first part of the question? Do I know of all the legal filings?
How many lawsuits are filed asking for stays or stops?
Sure. I don't know. We are aware of several. We do follow, the Roanoke Times has been one of your better resources probably than we are. We are not a party to any of those litigations. So what I know, you probably know as well, because we follow them as interested parties versus being a litigant. So I do know of several, but I don't know anything that y'all probably don't know. The most recent one that I'm aware of that we actually did attend, me and another staff member, was, of course, the one who's in our own federal district court over the eminent domain suit. We are not a landowner. Roanoke County is not a landowner that is affected by the pipeline, but several of our landowners are, and they are included in that, as well as in neighboring jurisdictions. So we do follow that as general interest, just as many of you do as citizens.
And before I ask the next question, it is at 8 o'clock. We'd originally planned to stop doing this here, but we've got all these great questions that you all have put together. What I'm going to suggest is that we handle as many of these as we can for the next 30 minutes. It's going to limit the amount of time we can kind of stay and do one-on-one questions, because we promised the school we'd have all of our stuff packed up and out of here by 9. But that being said, if we have actually more of this than I thought, which is good. Anybody that needs follow-up after we leave tonight, we'll schedule that one-on-one with you. We'll make arrangements for that. But I think it'd be good for us actually to do these questions in this group setting, because we're moving through a lot of good questions relatively quickly. So I'm going to go 30 more minutes than we originally planned doing this. That'll just limit the kind of time after, because I think that's going to be a better use of all of our time, because I could talk to 50 people instead of one person, which I think is more effective. Next question.
Wasn't there a second part of that question that I...
Yeah, and these are both the same, really, so I can read them together.
Okay.
The B part of the first question and this next card really have the same question, which is,
Okay.
what lawsuits has Roanoke County filed to challenge MVP? And basically, why do we assume it will be built? And the other one is, what legal actions are we involved in? So it's really asking,
Okay.
what are we doing on the litigation front, and why do we just assume the pipeline will happen?
Okay. On the litigation front, I think that Richard has already answered that our board was very generous with us to allow us to hire outside counsel. Obviously, this is my first and only FERC process, as is probably Richard's as well. So we were stumbling along, and we went to the board and we said, we need some assistance. So we did hire an outside law firm. They're actually out of Berkeley, California, and they've been advising us through this process. So what we did was we went through the analysis like any of you would if you were considering filing a lawsuit, and we looked at risk and likelihood of success. And we were steered, and this is unique because we are a local government, to challenge it through the FERC process. Any of you who are following the FERC subscriptions will see how many filings Roanoke County has done. And I think any of you who have been following are probably pretty impressed. I don't know about the efficacy of it, but every single juncture that we could challenge the FERC process, we have. When the FERC order was issued, and I don't want to minimize any of our other filings, we did file a notice of rehearing, which is the regulatory way to challenge a FERC filing. I know several other localities have done that as well. So that is the way that Roanoke County chose to address it through the legal process. Is there another part of that question?
No, that's
Okay.
those two questions. I guess the maybe thing I could add to that too is we did challenge the FERC order for rehearing, which does enable us to participate in certain legal actions as well. Our board would have to make a decision about that, but we have taken the preliminary steps already.
Right, and just to add, there are a couple of statuses that we chose to invoke. One is we are an intervener in the process, and those of you who have been following the pipeline understand what that is. We are also a consulting party in the Section 106 process. So post-FERC order, the Section 106 process is still an opportunity that we are challenging at every juncture. And matter of fact, today I was on the phone with Richmond over our status and what we consider to be the pipeline company's duty to consult with Roanoke County. So we are challenging the fact that we don't believe they have exercised all the opportunities to consult with Roanoke County. So we are looking after your interests in that way. I said already that we do not own a property in the pipeline process. Originally, the original route did have Camp Roanoke. We were originally in the pipeline route, which would have afforded us different legal standing, but when it was rerouted, we no longer had a property that was actually on the route. And that is significant from a legal status standing position. Through the Section 106 process, yes, we did. That was included in our challenge in the Section 106 process. And we're still trying to negotiate through that process, but not a stay in the federal courts. We've not gone through the court system.
Okay, and I'm going to try, because we are going to run out of time before we get through all the questions. And again, I just can't thank people enough for the good questions that they've prepared. Chief Simon, this one would be for you. Where can citizens go to read the burn permits and blasting permits MVP has to use? And I might interpret that as, is there a standard permit language that somebody could see if they wanted to learn about this?
We have a lot of that stuff on our county fire rescue website. That's where I would ask you to go to first. If you have any specific questions, there's a phone number on there. You can go ahead and contact our fire marshal's office or send them an email, and we'll try to answer any of your questions. But the process is a very regulated aspect for both burning and blasting.
Okay, and the next question is, will MVP personnel be required to show IDs before entering properties? As I mentioned earlier, I personally want to learn a little bit more about how FERC manages its properties, but I think that construction will look a lot different than the survey activity that's happened already, because once the area that the court order or the negotiated settlement, if there was one, is identified on the ground, I think sort of the opposite is going to be happening. What I envision is the contractor trying to control access to that property as a work site. So I do think some of the issues, I think we'll have different issues, but I think some of the issues we had during survey where at that point the company is exercising what they say is a state statute, but they don't really own anything or have any land rights. This will be different because when they're building something, they actually have land rights, just as the underlying property owner does. So I think that'll be a little different. I think it's going to be mostly about marking the ground rather than having to show somebody something, because at that point, it's really going to be the contractor probably trying to manage which people are in that easement area, because my guess is they probably don't want people in the easement area that aren't part of the construction if for no other reason for safety. Will MVP vehicles be allowed to go beyond the last construction point on Honeysuckle Road where they will turn around? MVP vehicles, this would really apply to anybody's vehicle. If you're on a public road, you're free to drive wherever you choose to drive as long as your vehicle is legally loaded, legal size, and there's no restriction on where people are allowed to drive in Virginia. So unless there's a specific posting like a through truck restriction or a bridge that has a weight restriction, Virginia probably has one of the least regulated environments for trucks and other vehicles of anywhere in the country that I know of. So, but as far as somebody from out of town that might be working on the project, they can get in their car and drive wherever they choose to drive as long as they're driving legally. There's not a restriction on where they can go. Where was the ENS work that Roanoke County looked at, the work that was so robust? As I mentioned earlier, as far as the actual ENS approval that DEQ is doing, our county engineer and his staff reviewed the review work that DEQ hired. So in other words, they had an engineer that went through and checked calculations and verified a lot of things. We reviewed that work because, again, we do not have the staff or resources to do a full review of their ENS plans. We did make a number of comments back to DEQ about what we had seen to date. So, we're doing a lot of good work, but I want to stress that it would literally take dozens and dozens of people to review every aspect of this project. That's beyond our capability, but we did exercise the expertise that we had to do as much review as was reasonable to try to assist DEQ in carrying out their obligations. What plans are in place for work stoppage when further archaeological artifacts are exposed? I'm not an expert in this, but I do know that there is in all the Section 106 documents, that's actually part of the plans that the company has to put in place, and there are very specific federal requirements. If you find artifacts, what you have to do, who you have to notify, and if you don't do that correctly, I know there's some very significant penalties for people involved. It's a concern I would share. There certainly have been artifacts that have been found in some of the preliminary work. There's a high likelihood that more will be found when you do excavation that's this extensive. So this would be another place where I think citizens could help us to help you. If you see something that looks like something has been found, let people know. You can let us know. I would call FERC. On our website, you'll also see contact information for the other agencies. But let somebody know as soon as you think something like that may have been uncovered, because there is, again, a pretty rigorous process that you're supposed to go through depending on the nature of the artifacts, and we would want to make sure that happens. FERC allows the locality to grant tax relief to affected landowners. Will the county be giving tax relief to landowners? If whoever asked this question could shoot me an email with details of that, I'm not aware of what this is with respect to FERC. I certainly explained how we normally treat taxation and changes in land use around property. But if there's something specific that FERC has spoken to, we'd like to learn more about that and would be happy to update folks on that after we do the research. Will fire and rescue airlift my family members out of an explosion? Will they go within a certain number of yards of homes to check on occupants? Chief Simon, you want to talk to what we do if there's an incident on a pipeline?
If there's an incident, any type of medical or emergency fire related, we'll go up there and evaluate the situation, and we're going to render appropriate care. If there was an event, and let's say there's a significant injury from a pipeline worker or a citizen or a visitor, they'll evaluate that situation and they'll go and make the appropriate decision. In some cases on Bent Mountain, you're in a more rural area, obviously, and you will go ahead and possibly use a helicopter to fly you out. It might not be flown out right where you're at. It might be moved to another location and then flown out depending on what the paramedic on scene feels that is the most appropriate. If there is some type of explosion after the fact when the pipeline's built, typically we're going to go ahead and check everything around, obviously, just to make sure that there are no casualties. In that process, once the gas, if the pipeline did have an explosion, once it is already in the ground, There's not a lot to go ahead and go right up to the pipeline and put out, because this is going to be extremely under a lot of gas under a lot of pressure. Once the gas had been turned off, that's where we would go in. However, if we can make reasonable access, we are going to go in and send our personnel in, as we would do with any other emergency. So like I say, we do have gas lines throughout the Roanoke Valley. They're not as big as this one. It's a little bit different based on the size, but we're not, we're used to responding to these type of emergencies in the sense of gas line breakages. So worst case scenario, we would go ahead and take appropriate action, and if we had to fly someone out on a helicopter, we have access unless weather was dependent and wouldn't allow us to fly.
And Chief Simon, the next question would also be for you. It says, will paid staff be added to Bent Mountain Fire and Rescue for night shift during construction?
As of right now, we rely on our volunteer contingent to go ahead and staff the Bent Mountain Station at night. During the daytime, we keep 2 paramedic firefighters up there 7 days a week from approximately 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. The Back Creek Station has firefighters that are staffed, firefighters and paramedics that are staffed 24 hours a day. Back Creek automatically responds up to the Bent Mountain Station in the event that a volunteer unit is not getting out. We also send units from our Cave Spring area, and we also have units from our Clearbrook area that would respond if the pipeline was, or if there was an issue on the 460 side. That would be our Fort Lewis. So at this time, I do not see any reason that we would go ahead and put additional staffing at nights on Bent Mountain, as we are utilizing our volunteer contingent.
Next question, is MVP offering money to the county to cover its cost or increase costs for this project for resources and staff? The answer to that is unfortunately no. They have not offered us anything for anything, be that staff impacts or other impacts. And I think, as we've demonstrated to you, we have invested a substantial amount of resources into this project, primarily in staff time, but also in legal fees. And we have not been reimbursed for anything, and nor do at this point we expect to be. So they have not given us anything. Will Roanoke County police officers be opening up the rescue station on Bent Mountain and escorting MVP personnel there to use the bathroom like they did during surveying? This is a concern that has been raised a number of times, and I think, again, something that we would expect and want to be different during construction, which is the company should be providing appropriate sanitation facilities for all of its personnel throughout the project. I do think that what will be different about the operation that's getting ready to come, if it does come to the county, is you have one sort of large contractor that, it has probably a more controlled operation in terms of where people are and what they're doing. But if that does get to be a problem, that is something that we certainly want to raise with the company. And, people shouldn't, people shouldn't be going to the bathroom without proper facilities and just going off in the woods somewhere. That's not the way you're supposed to run a job site. And I understand it's a real concern, and one that we will certainly raise with the company. And then the next question is, and I'm going to shorten this a little bit, but is the county still receiving notifications about surveying, specifically about recent survey, where folks were asked if they could walk down and access their property? Did we know about survey for January 18th and 19th? And I might refer that to Chief Hall.
We didn't receive that in the same manner in terms of timeliness as we had prior to. Once we were made aware that survey was going to take place, we requested and received the relevant documents from the company.
Okay. Next question is about blasting, and I think we've spoken to this already, but I think what I'm going to recommend is that we make a little section on our frequently asked questions about blasting and some of the requirements, because this is asking what the notification process is for blasting. And I'm not an expert in that, but I think that's something we could put some facts on our website about some general aspects of how blasting is regulated, who does what types of notices are done.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Richard. I would suggest whoever wrote that, if they would go ahead and send through that one contact card email and ask for a little bit more specific. Notification is typically provided by the permit holder who wants to go in and blast, and they notify us. So I'm a little confused possibly what their notification is. maybe if they could clarify that, we'll get them an answer.
Yeah, and I think there's another aspect of notification, which is, there's some notifications you do immediately before a blast and how you check the area. And I think we'll put together some information on blasting, because I know that's always a concern. Next question is, when will the county schedule another public meeting? I think as I indicated earlier, that this is something that in some form or fashion we see ourselves doing. It's impossible to say when we would, because that's so event-driven. So we planned this meeting because it appeared that there could be activity imminent in the county. Depending on what happens in some of the court proceedings with eminent domain, we're going to base that on the circumstances when we have something that we think is useful to share that's different. So if I set a meeting for a month from now and we didn't really know anything more than we know tonight, it probably wouldn't be too useful, but it could be we know a whole lot more in a month, and it'd be very useful. So we always kind of base those on how things are progressing, and we always want these things to be value added for the citizens. So that's how we would plan a meeting like this. Have representatives from Roanoke Gas Company communicated with the county? Only in a very limited fashion and a long time ago when the project was first being planned. So we have not had much ongoing communication with Roanoke Gas about the project. Why didn't MVP representatives come to this meeting? We didn't invite them to participate. I guess they could have come. Maybe there's somebody here from the company in the audience. I don't know. The reason we didn't do that is, quite frankly, for all the things that I would be interested in sharing with you, they haven't been very forthcoming about giving us any plans, and it just didn't seem like there'd be a whole lot of value and somebody that wouldn't really tell you anything being up before you. So we thought, in the absence of information or really wanting to share anything, what would they be here for? If they had a different attitude toward that in the future and wanted to share stuff with folks, we'd be happy to have them come. And in fact, I'd probably prefer them to talk about their project and have me talk about it. But since we have not gotten anything out of them really to share, as I mentioned before, I just didn't see the value in that, and nor do I know if they would have come if we'd invited them, but we did not invite them. What specific training are fire and EMS personnel receiving to respond to leaks and explosions?
Well, like I mentioned earlier, we are used to going ahead and to responding to gas leaks. It's not an uncommon occurrence. We have the pipelines that run through the county. Our personnel go through training on an annual basis. We meet with the local gas line manufacturers. We go through their emergency plans. We have plans to go ahead in the event of some of their situations that we'd be able to respond to. Our personnel have the training. Just keep in mind, a gas leak, if it's just leaking gas, there's not a lot for fire rescue to actually do except secure the scene. Because it's this unsafe environment, we want to get everyone away from it as fast as we can, obviously. Secondly, if there was a fire, it's gas, you're not going to be able to extinguish that unless the gas is actually cut off. In those pipelines and all the pipelines, when they have a drop in pressure, that sets off internal mechanisms on the gas line that will go and trigger certain aspects for it to stop sending it. But once that gas is going through, it's going to have to go and probably burn its way out. And once it burns out, then we're going to go in and extinguish it. What we're going to be going ahead and do is protecting exposures. So, for example, if there was a gas leak, we're going to go in and contact the gas company, and we're going to go in and secure the area, and then they're going to go in and mitigate the emergency. If there was a fire gas leak, we're going to still do the exact same thing. However, we're going to go in and try to protect exposures, meaning that anything that of a structure, anyone that's in the air, we're going to go and evacuate them. In some cases, we'll go in and put a foam blanket down around the area so the fire would not extend into the woods or into any structures. This is somewhat a normal occurrence in the fire service. Our personnel are trained to do this. We are part of the Virginia Department of Emergency Management Foam Task Force. We have our partners in Roanoke City and City of Salem for a hazmat response. So I'm not necessarily concerned about our personnel not being trained in the event of an incident. It is just the scope of the event and the locality of where this pipeline might be if there was a problem with it, and that's the more challenging aspect of this.
Okay, how is the county going to ensure that MVP even knows where the right-of-way is? They testified in a recent trespassing case in county court that they were using county tax maps to survey, so they didn't even know where the property lines were, therefore they didn't know they were trespassing. I think, as I mentioned earlier, they're going to have to get out and do on-the-ground survey and do it right. Our GIS system, our tax maps are not intended to be substitutes for professional survey. You have to be properly licensed to do that in Virginia, and I understand the concern, and that's something that both has to be done differently and done right. It has to be marked clearly. And then another worker sanitation question about basically them having proper bathroom facilities during construction. I could not agree more, and I wouldn't want somebody going to the bathroom in the wrong place on my property, and I understand why you wouldn't want it on yours. Question about, this is for Chief Hall, said, why are there at least 14 police here? Is it necessary? Seems like overkill and a waste of money.
We make deployment decisions of our personnel based on what we anticipate needs to be. Sometimes that's taking a pessimistic approach. Some of the folks here tonight are also administrative and command staff that are involved in the planning for our response to this particular operation.
Let me see, because I'm running out of time again. There's one I definitely want to hit. Is MVP making offers to Roanoke County for anything besides Bent Mountain Elementary School? Is the offer about Bent Mountain while the county just put the school on a capital improvement project or plan? And the answer to both of those questions is no, and I want to make sure everybody's clear on this. MVP has not offered us anything, anywhere. And we did put that school forward as something that they could potentially invest in as part of the Section 106 process. We did that on advice of our legal counsel in a public filing. But the company has not agreed or offered to do anything for us. And the reason that project is on our capital improvement plan that we released to our board on Tuesday is there's going to have to be an investment made in that facility to keep it usable into the future, as anybody that's been there is well aware. So that's completely unrelated to this project. There's just going to have to be work done if that's going to continue to be in public use. If there was some way the company did some of that work for us, that would be great. But we've got to take on the challenges of that building if it's going to stay in use, irregardless of this project, if it stopped tomorrow. But that was an advice of our council that is something they've done. Some of the other counties along the route were offering up similar public structures. So if that was something agreed to as part of the Section 106 process, I'd rather have it than not, but we don't know what's going to be the outcome there. Probably got time for two more, and then we're going to wrap this up. How will the county respond to spills? Chief Simon has talked about that a little bit, but I want to expound on the question because I want to say the type of spill that I would be most concerned about. A lot of folks focus on the actual pipe in its operation, which is primarily gas. The type of spills that I would be concerned about on this project would be a piece of equipment turning over near the river and dumping hydraulic oil or fuel, those types of spills. That is something that DEQ regulates, but those would be the concerns I have. And there's requirements that DEQ has about where fuel can be stored because they do oftentimes store fuel near the work site. And then there's procedures that you're supposed to follow if something does happen in, a common occurrence, or not common, but one thing that could happen is, say, a hydraulic line breaks on a piece of equipment that's operating near water, and you need to respond to that immediately. So those are the types of, I would be more concerned about spills related to the construction activity itself than probably the actual pipe once it's in service. And again, those are the kind of things that if somebody saw something that looked like that, let us know. Don't assume somebody's reported that and that they know, because you're not supposed to have any fuel leaking on the ground anywhere. And with a lot of equipment, that is something that can happen and something we'd be very concerned about. What is the county's plan to provide water to families whose wells get ruined? Today, Roanoke County does not provide water to anybody. The West Virginia Water Authority provides public water. But this is one of the things that we really, if there was one thing we focused on the most in the regulatory process, it was trying to bring this point up to people, that our residents are almost exclusively served by wells and springs. Ultimately, how that water is restored is something that the company has to cause to happen, that FERC is supposed to make them do. This would be really high on my list of bad things that could happen we would be worried about, that we would want to try to help you with if this has happened to you. And we have filed dozens and dozens of pages raising these very concerns. So I think that's a very valid concern, particularly with blasting and heavy construction. And of all the things I want to be responsive to a citizen about, if it did occur, it would be an issue with water. And while we're not the regulator, we would want to help. With that, it's just before 8:30. I want to thank everybody that came tonight, all the great questions, and I know this is not the normal format folks are used to, but by doing these in writing, we were able to handle a huge number of questions in a short period of time. We will stay around for a few minutes while you'll see folks packing up, because we did promise the school we would be gone by 9 o'clock. But thank you so much for coming. I encourage you to look at our website, and if there's a follow-up question you don't get answered tonight, just send an email to that address and we'll follow up with you. But thank you again.